partner, competitor, system, rival. Can you rank and or explain the current state of EU-China relationship? Also, maybe with what we've heard from Ursula von der Leyen with her speech.
Yes. I think it's quite symbolic in terms of this kind of a breaking point, symbolic point in EU-China relations, with von der Leyen very strongly underlining a change in EU's attitude towards China. So for many years, we've been talking about the need to somehow redefine the way we think about cooperation with China. So we have this trilateral distinction between an economic partner. So obviously there's a whole debate about China being indispensable to the EU's market and trade. But we also talk about systemic rival in terms of the way the CCP and Xi Jinping have been restructuring the way the Chinese party state works, how he has centralized his power, and what kind of implications it has on the EU as well. And we're also talking about competitor. So competitor in terms of economics, in the way Chinese economy is increasingly centered on becoming self-sufficient, and what kind of implications it has for the competitiveness of European firms from different countries and different regions of Europe. Mm-hmm. And I think that von der Leyen's speech in this context really clearly signals to Beijing, also in the context of her upcoming visit to China, that we cannot return to business as usual. This is not a scenario that can actually happen. But also, I think it's very important to understand that despite the fact that we see this whole trend towards more rational, realistic policy towards China at the EU level, we still have a whole variety of voices in different capitals. So we cannot talk about EU unity vis-a-vis China. Mm-hmm. And we still have a very long way to go to actually create something that could appear as a coherent EU strategy towards rising China.
It seems like that even the relationship between the European Union and China becomes more a rivalry. Would you agree?
Well, I think the context already pushes us there. But I think there were elements of all three of them. I think it's broadly, but I think in the context of the Ukraine war, the sense is that Russia and China have an authoritarian regime, and they are getting closer together. So the challenge to the West and to Europe is bigger because systemic rival, as I understand, is more about their own domestic political systems, and that we think that those are highly problematic, and therefore we need to, in certain areas, de-risk, which was the buzzword.
Why is it so hard for the EU member states to develop a coherent China strategy?
As I said, there is a multitude of stakeholders and interests in different countries and regions. We have Germany having a very special and very important position vis-a-vis Beijing, with China and the CCP picturing Germany as this heart of both European politics, but as well as the economy. We have very important players such as France or Italy with strong economic links and interests, but we also have smaller countries that are trying to leverage this relationship with certain political elites in countries such as Hungary, Poland to a certain degree, still perceiving China as an attractive economic partner, but also there is a very important and a crucial change of perceptions regarding China in the context of the war in Ukraine. And being based in Warsaw, I think that we really have to underline that. In the past year, given China's tacit approval for the Russian aggression over Ukraine, China is being perceived increasingly as an actor that is actually stepping into and trying to reshape European security architecture to the detriment of countries such as Poland or the Baltic states, with Beijing saying that it is against NATO enlargement and portraying the war in Ukraine as a proxy war of the US.
Well, I don't know whether we should be so tough on, the paper from 2019, the outlook was broadly then accepted as the main framework. It was, yes, agreed by all of them. And possibly, I think we, you know, in the Russian sanctions, you know, we saw that there was unity for 10 packages. In China, you know, I mean, China's big, is a different beast, and there are many different interests. But for example, in the CAI, there was as well a council agreement. And I think there is a bit now this relationship between the Commission being a bit the bad cop with China, perhaps with the parliament or certain elements of the parliament, the more vocal ones, and the council being more kind of, you know, this more pragmatic that looks more on perhaps cooperation or at least doing business side of things.
Should the EU position itself as a middle power between US and China?
Well, it depends what you mean by positioning itself as a middle power. First of all, we have Macron's idea of European strategic autonomy, which for China means Europe distancing itself from the US in order to prevent this more unified approach towards Beijing's revisionism. And this is something that China would like to see and exploit. And in the context of Macron's visit to Beijing, this is an element that for sure will be high on the agenda on the Chinese side. So it's about putting a wedge between Europe and the US. But I think that you know, it's important to go beyond talking about strategic autonomy in terms that we are used to, and maybe trying to find a new way of framing and thinking about the future of Europe that could be strategically important as an actor, as a unified community, but also not necessarily a pawn in the bigger game of between the US and China.
I think we cannot be equidistant. So it's not to be in the middle of them. I think we are broadly, obviously, a strong ally of the United States. But we have a different approach. And I think yesterday's speech by von der Leyen shows that, right? I mean, certainly not decoupling. We are into the de-risking aspect. And we are still kind of fine of doing business with China. But, you know, we might be having more defensive tools in terms of what China, you know, can impose or can coerce us with. And we might, as I said, de-risk in certain areas where we think that we have over-dependency on China.